At the beginning of June, I recorded a podcast with Keith Hirshland, the lead TV producer for the LIV Golf League. A few days later, the golf world had a meltdown. On June 6, 2023, the PGA Tour, the DP World Tour, and Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund announced they were going into business together. With that announcement, arguably the biggest news story in the history of the game, my conversation with Keith was officially outdated. So we improvised. With thanks to Keith for being generous with his time, welcome to the first ever two-part episode of Media Credentials.
I demand satisfaction.
My name is Whit Watson, and this is Media Credentials. I'm a sports announcer who's worked a lot of places. This podcast will peel back the layers of sports media and show you how the sausage gets made. Through interviews with industry pros and my own experience, you'll understand why you're seeing what you're seeing and who's responsible for it. Your media credentials have been approved. Keith Hirshland is an Emmy-winning sports TV producer whose path started in Hawaii, passed through Orlando as he helped launch the Golf Channel, and now finds him in the producer's chair for live broadcast of the upstart LIV Golf League. LIV is backed by the Public Investment Fund, the sovereign wealth fund of Saudi Arabia. That June 6th announcement I mentioned means that the PGA Tour plans to go into business with the PIF, something that nobody saw coming. I could not publish the episode with Keith without getting his reaction to the news, and as mentioned, he was nice enough to come back on. But what exactly is the news? This has been widely reported as a merger, which may be a bit hasty. Here's part of what PGA Tour Commissioner Jay Monahan wrote in a letter to tour players dated June 6. Quote, "Through a framework agreement, the Public Investment Fund, PIF, is contributing its golf-related commercial businesses and rights, including LIV Golf, along with a significant financial investment toward minority equity ownership of a new collectively held for-profit LLC. This new entity, named TBD, will also include the PGA Tour's commercial businesses and rights, as well as those of the DP World Tour." End quote. Notably, the word merger never appears in Monahan's letter. My dad, the lawyer, likes to say that an agreement to agree is not an agreement. And that's kind of what this feels like. I was on the air on Golf Channel for several hours on that Tuesday, and even now, a week later, the details are still hard to pin down. Here's the chat I had with Keith after June 6, part 2 of the podcast, before we get to part 1. So, Keith, tell me how you found out about this seismic piece of news earlier this week.
Well, I was walking the dogs, Whit, something I do on a daily basis, and I got my phone vibrated with a text message from a friend who, with whom I'd been conversing over the last couple of days, and all it said was, "Are you okay? I hope this works out for you." And I thought, okay, this must have been a message intended for somebody else. So I said, "Was that for me?" And this person said, "Yeah, haven't you seen the news?" And I said, "What news?" And he said, "LIV and the PGA Tour are joining forces." And I said, "That can't be true." And he said, "It's on CNBC right now." So got back in the car, turned on the radio, got back home, turned on the TV, and found out that, as you say, this seismic shift that no one saw coming had actually happened.
So I guess that answers my next question, which is, was there any scuttlebutt from the LIV side of things that this was even being talked about?
I am way down on the food chain, Whit.
Okay.
But I can tell you from my perspective, zero.
In the ensuing days since this announcement was made, has there been any internal communication with LIV? Have you received any kind of company memo or a conference call, anything like that?
There have been some normal calls that take place on a weekly basis. We always have a weekly production team meeting, and there's always a bi-weekly company-wide State of the Union call. And on all those, the only thing that we've been told, my team, our team, the production team has been told is it's business as usual. We still have 7 events left this year. We have a schedule that is firming up for 2024 and venues being signed and locations being looked at and all those things. And it's, people are rightly nervous, I guess is a good word to say, but the folks that are above me, again, on the food chain, have been nothing but supportive and saying nothing but we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. So, let's go continue to provide the best live tournament golf coverage that we can provide on a weekly basis and, continue to innovate and continue to look at ways where we can get better every day. And that's what we're doing. And don't listen to the white noise. Don't listen to all the stuff that's out there in the Twitterverse and everywhere else. It's just, let's keep doing our jobs.
What was, other than surprise, now that you've had a couple of days to digest this, what do you think, just overall impression about this announcement?
I keep going back and forth. And, I think, well, is this a good thing? Is this a great thing? Is this, I can't imagine many scenarios where it's bad for golf. So that's positive. I have no idea. I got no indication other than, like I said, people are telling us to just keep doing what you're doing. It's business as usual, that there is anything that I need to worry about or can do anything about in terms of my job. I have a contract through the end of next year. And as far as I know, that remains in place. So I've been on the other, I've been through this kind of thing a few times now in my life and my career. It's always business as usual until it isn't. And this is the first time, I think, in my professional and personal life that I've been, if you can say there are sides, I've been on the side of the one that's coming in. It's not a takeover. It's not a merger. I don't know what you want to call this thing, but on the side of the entity that's, bringing the money and bringing potentially, the decisions that are being made. Who knows? Again, I'm talking like I know something and I don't. So I should probably just stop.
That's okay. The reporting over the last few days, granted, we don't know much. Nobody knows anything. You and I agree on that. And there wasn't much in the announcement. But the announcement was fairly clear as to what this partnership is. And subsequently, Jimmy Dunn, who's on the PGA Tour's policy board, who made the first phone call, explained it in an article on SI.com that the PIF has the right of first refusal to make investments. There are no dollars promised at this point. But Keith, the reporting has been so wrong, constantly using the word merger or takeover, or I've even seen national outlets refer to it as the PGA LIV merger. Every single phrase of that is wrong. It's the PGA Tour, it's not LIV, and it's not a merger. Have you noticed that as well, that the reporting has been shoddy?
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, I think there are still very few people in this world that know what's going on. They've even said, right? From what I've read, that it's the framework of a deal, right?
Yeah.
There
Yes.
is not, I'm guessing right now there are people way smarter than me and you. Well, you're pretty smart, but working out a 1,000-page document that's,
Right.
that's going to define whatever this might end up being. I think everybody, in this world, this is this crazy world that we live in now, that everybody wants to be first and everybody wants to be, get the clicks, and everybody wants to say, see right here, I tweeted this out on June 7th, 2023. So I'm the guy that got it all right, or,
That broke the story, right?
that broke the story. And nobody's willing to sit back and go, okay, something really big just happened. Let's just take a breath and wait and see what it all means.
I completely agree with Keith on his last couple of points. We don't know what this new business will be, And for that matter, there are still significant hurdles ahead, and I'll get back to that later. Anyway, on to part two, or part one. Some necessary background. Keith's wife, Sarah Hirshland, is currently the CEO of the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee. Prior to that, she worked for the USGA as the Senior Managing Director of Business Affairs and later the Chief Commercial Officer. Sarah was the lead negotiator in 2013 when the USGA granted its media rights to Fox. That's important to the story Keith tells about publishing his memoir, which went to press on the same weekend that the new USGA deal was announced. Remember that. Also, Keith is now a published author several times over, starting with that memoir and followed by a series of mystery novels. And that's where I started our initial interview, asking him about his second career as a writer.
The writing thing was, I look back on it now, and it's crazy to think that I have written now 6 books. We just finished the last one. So it is at the publishers. They're working on the cover, working on final preparation and all that good stuff. So yeah, 6 books that when I first started writing the first one, Cover Me Boys, I'm Going In, Tales of the Tube from a Broadcast Brat, I hadn't envisioned any of that happening. The memoir came about because I had just lost both my parents in 2007, my dad first, and then subsequently my mom. And, we were doing what kids do when their parents pass. And, we were over on Maui going through all their stuff. And my wife, Sarah, who unfortunately hadn't, I met her later in life and hadn't, one of my big regrets is that she hadn't gotten a lot of time with my parents. We were going through boxes of things and there were all these commendations and awards and, letters from presidents and congratulating my dad and, the great work he had done with the Nevada Association of Broadcasters and starting a television station in Reno and, being a pioneer in the local television community and all this stuff. And she just looked at me and she said, I had no idea. I had no idea your mom and dad did all this. And she said, don't this be your kids. Don't let your kids be looking in a box when you're gone and saying, we had no idea dad won an Emmy and we had no idea dad did this and knew famous athletes and helped start, a couple of television networks. And so she said, start writing down, in a journal, just write down some stories about your career and your experiences and, leave it for them. And so I started doing that. And about halfway through that process, I kind of looked at the whole project and said, nobody's telling these stories about the early days of the Golf Channel. There still has not been a Golf Channel book put out. And I said, this could be a book. And so we approached it a little differently. And I started writing it in terms of, how could this be a book? And that's how Cover Me Boys, I'm Going In started. I self-published it. And then about 2 years after we self-published it, a traditional publisher reached out to me out of the blue and said, we found this book. We think it's great. We want to sign you to a contract and republish it under our banner. Would that be okay with you? And I just laughed and said, well, of course. And since then, they've published, 3 subsequent works of fiction. So I'm proudly in the Beacon Publishing Group stable.
Tell me what your dad did. I know that he was in Honolulu, in Hawaii for a while, in Reno, obviously. You were essentially born into the business. What exactly did he do?
He was in the Navy, and when he got out of the Navy, he and my mom settled in Honolulu, and so he started working for a radio station as kind of in those days, as you can appreciate, it was the 1950s, and he was a salesperson selling ads to local Honolulu business people that wanted to advertise on the radio station, and at the same time, under the pen name of Lee Anders, was the sports guy and did the sports report and did a good job, I guess, because the folks that owned the station, a gentleman named Don Reynolds, who also owned a few television stations and other radio stations around the country, took notice and asked my dad if he wanted to go run his Don Reynolds television station in Reno, Nevada. We lived in Honolulu after I was born for 2 years. My dad got the job in Reno. So as a 2-year-old, I moved to Reno, Nevada. At the time, my dad was running the CBS affiliate in Reno. It was KOLO TV. It's still there. And at the time, there were only 2 TV stations in Reno. There was the CBS affiliate and there was the NBC affiliate. ABC was kind of just getting started. And those 2, they shared ABC programming. So they had some kind of a deal where Channel 8, my dad's station, would air a certain number or a couple of ABC programs, and Channel 4, which was KCRL at the time, would air other ABC programming. And so after a while, my mom and dad thought, well, this is silly. ABC should have a network affiliate station in Reno. So they got a group of, we were doing pretty well, had a nice house, and my dad and mom drove nice cars, and, life was pretty good for a kid in Reno, Nevada in the early mid 60s. And all of a sudden my dad and mom took everything that they had worked for, everything that they had saved, and took out loans and got a group of local Reno businessmen together and decided to put together this group that would start KTVN, which would be at the time the ABC affiliate. So we went from, our nice house and nice cars to an Edsel station wagon and living in rental properties around Reno for a little bit, which was still an adventure. My parents made it fun, obviously. But they, blood, sweat, and tears, started this TV station. And, through a couple of fortunate circumstances, at the time, the CBS affiliate, my dad's old station, and CBS had a bit of a falling out about the amount of network programming that KOLO was airing in the in the kind of like the fringe times. And they had a bit of a disagreement, and my dad leapt at the chance. And at the time, CBS was the #1 station in America with shows like Gunsmoke and others, Andy Griffith, I guess, and others. And so KTVN became the CBS affiliate and is still that to this day. But basically, to go back to your question, my mom and dad took the chance to start a new station. They made it the priority to service the community. And to my dad and mom, that meant covering things like local sports, University of Nevada football and basketball, high school football games, an emphasis on election coverage. No station in Reno had ever done election night live returns coverage on the air,
right.
Showing the state of the state address from Carson City live. They did a show called, they took a chance on a magazine show that was airing at the time called PM Magazine.
Sure.
That Westinghouse stations had kind of franchised out to smaller markets around the country, and, had a local host and told local stories about the community. So, they just built it from the grassroots up, from the ground up. And, they really made an impact, I think, on the Reno community.
So it seems like it was inevitable that you would end up working in television. And you were at ESPN for a time. What was the time frame when you were working there, and what did you do?
My journey to ESPN was a roundabout one, to say the least. I played golf in college. I wanted to play golf, and I was a pretty good player in Northern Nevada. But as you can imagine, a pretty good player in Northern Nevada isn't very good in other parts of the country. And I went to school and found out that my 69s and 70s and 71s weren't going to go very far against guys shooting 62 and 63. So,
right.
I just kind of decided, well, that's not going to work. So what's next? And I was a journalism major in school and thought, well, I want to stay close to sports. I mean, I grew up a huge sports fan. My family were a family of fans. And I wanted to, so that was kind of what I wanted to do. And I thought, let's see if I can do something in sports TV, which turned out, luckily, my dad owned the station. I was that kid. The sports director was out shooting some, we had a local hockey team called the Reno Aces, a minor league hockey team. The sports director showed up there one night with his camera, and I said hello, and he was complaining that, he didn't want to be there. And I was like, well, I'll shoot highlights. And he handed me the Super 8 camera and said, drop the film cartridge and the camera back off at the station when you're done. So that was my intro into sports television, and worked at the station for a while, and then decided that I wanted to expand my horizons. So ESPN was hiring a director. And at the time when I was working in Reno, I was doing a little bit of everything. I was on air, and then I went behind the scenes. I realized really early on that I loved working in television. I hated being on television. So I went behind the scenes, and as a director, directed news, sent ESPN. They were hiring a director, sent ESPN my reel. The gentleman who was at ESPN at the time was willing to take a chance on me, hired me to come to ESPN to direct. So I quit my job in Reno, went to visit a friend in Phoenix for a little bit. And as I was getting ready to go to Bristol, I called up and asked for some, logistical questions. And the woman said, I'm sorry, the gentleman who will remain nameless no longer works here.
Uh-oh.
And nobody told me this. And so I was like, well, he hired me. And she said, I'm not sure that's going to work. Let me put you in touch with somebody else. This person said, yeah, that's unfortunate. We've kind of had to start over the hiring process. I've got your reel. I'm impressed with your work, but quite frankly, I can't hire you as somebody working directing news in Reno to come work and direct SportsCenter at ESPN. So, make a long story even longer, he said, there is a director's position open at WTNH in New Haven, which is just down the road from ESPN. And he said, I've recommended you to them. Why don't you give their guy a call? His name is Dennis Blader, and see what he says. So Dennis Blader said yes. So I packed up my bags, moved to New Haven, Connecticut, to work at WTNH, the whole time hoping that another opportunity would come up in Bristol, and it never did. So moving forward again, I got tired of doing what I was doing in New Haven. So my parents had sold the station and moved to Hawaii, and were living on Maui, and were working as volunteers for ESPN Golf whenever they came to the islands. And I had a long talk with my dad, and he said, I'm pretty good friends with the guys at ESPN Golf. If that's what you want to do, then why don't you let me make a couple of phone calls? So he did that, got back to me and said, there's a guy named Paul Spengler. He basically runs ESPN Golf out of a production company in LA called Ohlmeyer Communications. Don Ohlmeyer ran it.
Yep. And
Paul said to give him a call. So I called Paul, and Paul said, oh, great. Your dad's great. We love your mom and dad. If this is something you want to do, send me your resume. I sent him the resume, call again, another phone call. He says, if you can get yourself out here, I'll get you a job. So, me being me, I quit the job at WTNH, loaded up the car, and drove to Los Angeles with just the promise of a job, and which took a while to materialize, to say the least. So that finally happened. And again, I'm getting to the end. I'm getting to the answer to your question. But so Ohlmeyer Communications produced all the IndyCar racing and golf for ESPN. So after some convincing, they hired me to work on their golf shows. And about a few months after I got hired, Don sold his production company to ESPN, and we all became ESPN employees. So in a roundabout way, I ended up working for ESPN, eventually left Ohlmeyer in January of 1994 to go actually work in Bristol to help launch ESPN2.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I was doing when I heard about this upstart new television network that was going to be devoted 24/7 to golf.
Well, you've taken me right there because 1994, they were in boxes. There was temporary office space. I can recall, actually, I interviewed for a job with Golf Channel with Mike Whalen, who was the original executive producer,
Yep.
for like an assistant to the producer job. And it launched in January of 1995.
Yep.
I talked to Mike about that time period and how quickly everybody had to ramp up. There was a very small window of time to get on the air between moving into those offices and then launching in January of 1995. What are your recollections about those wild, wild west days when Golf Channel was just starting and trying to meet that deadline, get yourself on the air?
I look back on it now, and you mentioned Mike Whalen, who, in my opinion, creatively was a genius. I mean, he had a vision that he had an energy and a vision that I had never run across before in my entire life, let alone in my career. And I will be forever grateful to Mike for the opportunity that he gave me to be a part of the Golf Channel. I was still in Bristol, and it was the summer, and we started hearing rumblings and rumors about, hey, this, Golf Channel, there's going to be a Golf Channel, and they're starting a network that's going to be, 24/7, 365 golf. And I was listening to all these folks talk about it and heard the rumors, and actually a couple of people that were at ESPN had left to join the Golf Channel. And I was, sitting to myself in the corner and getting ready to produce another sports night show and thinking, why hasn't my phone rang? I worked 5 years for ESPN Golf and feeling sorry for myself a little bit. And then all of a sudden, one day in mid to end of September, the phone call came. Mike Whalen called me. I think to be honest with you, and I'm not sure Mike has ever said it or would ever say it, but I think he had exhausted every person who had ever sat in the chair and done anything with golf. And they all told him no, and flew down to Orlando. And Mike basically interviewed me on the golf course. We played 9 holes of golf, and he made me an offer. And it was funny because at the time he made me this, very generous offer. And I had a family and 2 young children, a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old at home in Connecticut. And I thought, I said, I got to think about this. And he said, you can think about it, but you have until midnight tonight to let me know. I was like, okay, no pressure there. So anyway, it was, it was my dream job. It's what I wanted to do. And so I ended up, convincing my wife at the time we had just moved the family from LA to Bristol in January of that year. And now we're going to up and move again to Orlando, Florida. So anyway, we did that, and it was great because basically Mike and the folks at Golf Channel, Bob Greenway, Joe Gibbs, Gary Stevenson, were like, we don't know anything about how to produce a golf tournament, and you do. And they hired a director named Emmett Loughran, who I had worked with before, who was great, very talented guy and a very nice guy. And, we had worked together on Ohlmeyer golf broadcasts. So we kind of patterned our coverage after the coverage that Ohlmeyer did for ESPN, and they kind of left us alone. It was nice because they were like, we'd done a couple of test events. There was a Gary Player tour at the time in Orlando, and we took all our facilities and all the gear and all the camera guys and basically televised to nobody, except tape machines, a couple of those events. We did the PGA Tour qualifying tournament at Greenleaf in 1994 before we launched as our final rehearsal event. And everybody was kind of like, well, these guys know what they're doing. And we have so many other things to worry about inside the building in Orlando that we're just going to let them do their own thing. And it was really fun for about 5 years when, they kind of left us to our own devices. And, I tell a few stories in the book about some of those early days, but it was the wild, wild west, but it was amazing. And I don't think that there will never be anything like that again.
The NBC golf producer Tommy Roy likes to say during a U.S. Open, for example, if you're good enough to make the tournament, you deserve to be on camera at some point during the event. So he goes through a checklist. They will check off names to make sure that every player gets camera time at some point. What is your overriding philosophy on producing a live golf tournament?
I think it is important to show a lot of golf. I learned producing a golf tournament from two of the smartest guys in the business, a producer named Andy Young and a director named Steve Bime. And the philosophy was, pick a story and tell it. So if your story is you're going to follow a certain group, tell that story, but that can't be the only, there has to be stuff that you weave in and out of telling that story. And golf, as you know, can change on a dime. If you pick a group to follow and they all stink it up after the first four holes, you have to change your story and then pick a different one to tell. But I always felt like there was plenty of time to do both, to tell a story that maybe was the initial thought process at the beginning of the day, but at the same time, show a lot of golf. And as a fan, as a viewer, that's what I like. I like to see guys hit golf shots as opposed to guys walking around lining up a putt or guys walking up the fairway when they're not quite ready to play. As well as I do. And, most golf tournaments, there's in a 156 player field, half the field is on the golf course at the same time. So there's always something going on. There's always a golf shot to show. So my philosophy is, why not show that, as long as it doesn't kind of derail your main story of the day. And to me, nothing as a viewer and as a producer makes less sense than showing a professional golfer tap in a 1 or 2 foot putt. Just record that, because 99 times out of 100, they're going to make it. And that one time out of 100 that they don't, you have it recorded somewhere on a tape machine and you can show it. But to stay and watch as a professional spends 30 to 45 seconds to putt a putt that's a foot long just seems silly to me. So I always go somewhere else. One of the things I learned early on that these guys taught me, Andy and Steve, was there are 2 ways to create pace. Golf is inherently a pretty slow sport. So there's 2 ways that you can create pace in a telecast. One is by going shot to shot to shot to shot. That creates pace. The other is the director using multiple cameras while showing a specific shot. So to go from a wide shot to a tight shot of hands to a face to a crowd, those are the 2 ways that the way I learned were to create pace. So that's what I'm trying to do a lot when I produce a golf tournament, is just keep the viewer kind of leaning forward. And it's one of the things we do at LIV Golf that I think that nobody else does, is that's kind of our philosophy with the entire coverage, is have the viewer lean forward. We don't want the guy leaning back and taking a nap. We want him leaning into what we're doing, and showing a lot of golf, in my mind, is a great way to do that.
Let's go back to the first book. It was published, as you said, self-published during the weekend of the 2013 U.S. Women's Amateur in Charleston, South Carolina. I was in the booth. It was an eventful couple of days, because the USGA that weekend, during that national championship, announced a new broadcast agreement with Fox. And then you clicked send on the book being published, and there were some, shall we say, complex relationships. There was a lot of overlap in those events, and then things got a little complicated with Golf Channel. So can you give me the Reader's Digest version of what happened when you published the book?
Yeah. I look back on that time now, and I think I was oblivious. I had written this memoir and was so proud of that accomplishment that I didn't, I got extremely I got extremely selfish and naive, I guess is the best way to put it, because, and quite frankly, in writing the book, there are, my mother-in-law was my first editor, and God bless her, because there were some parts of that book that I told some stories that didn't need to be told. And if I didn't have somebody like her as the governor on this thing, it could have been ugly. But she was great, and she was like, you can't say this, and you can't write this, and maybe you ought to think about rewriting this. So anyway, I told a bunch of stories in the book, a bunch of stories about my parents and my career, and then ESPN, and then Golf Channel, and how Golf Channel changed from this mom and pop shop to this billion-dollar business with corporate types taking over, and the whole thing changed. And throughout the whole thing, Whit, I got to tell you, as I said, in retrospect, I thought I did a pretty good job of, keeping it civil and being complimentary to folks that deserve my compliments. And I didn't think twice about hitting send, like you said, hitting publish on this thing. As you said, there were some complex relationships. The USGA, with my wife basically at the helm of this particular decision, decided to go away from what had been their traditional broadcaster, NBC, and sign a big deal with Fox. It was Fox's foray into not only golf, but obviously major championship golf. And I think those parallel universes clashed and came together, and the folks at NBC, Universal, and Comcast didn't like the book, to put it mildly. I did that women's amateur. I was scheduled to do one more event that year, which was the Walker Cup. And I got a phone call from the folks at NBC, and basically said that my services were no longer required. And I asked why. And they said, because you violated the code and you published a book. And I point blank, I was taken aback, and I said, did you read it? And this person said, I don't have to read it. So my time at Golf Channel came to an end. And as I look back now, honestly, I was bitter about it for a long time. And as I look back now, honestly, Whit, I probably stayed 2, 3, maybe 5 years longer than I should have. I can be a pretty stubborn guy, as people like to point out. And, I was a little unwilling to accept the changes that were happening there. And I probably should have gone a couple of years before I did. But, again, looking back on it now, I know my wife would probably disagree with this comment, but I wouldn't have done anything any differently.
What made you decide, after a number of years, to get back into golf on TV when the LIV opportunity came around?
Well, let me just start the answer to that question by saying I was perfectly happy being retired and writing books and walking the dogs here in Colorado and supporting my wife as her career blossomed, and as she was doing and continues to do amazing things in her life and her career. And I was perfectly happy to be that support system, and to let my creative outlet out by writing these silly mysteries. And I got a phone call from one of the guys I mentioned a little bit earlier, Steve Bime, who I had worked with at Ohlmeyer and remained friends forever and ever. And he said that he was going to work for LIV Golf, and would I be interested in producing 1 or 2 of their events? And, I thought, no. And then I thought again, and I thought, it was funny. I should go back a little bit, because a guy that I had worked with, who was one of our production folks at Golf Channel, named Scott Kazakowicz, had moved to Singapore and was working for the Asian Tour Media. And he was producing and directing a lot of their coverage. And he called me before LIV called. He called me from out of the blue and said, listen, I'm in a bind. I need a producer to do the Saudi International in December or November of 21. And would I be interested? And I thought, that'd be fun. I've never been to Saudi Arabia. Probably would never go if this, opportunity didn't come up. Sure. As long as I don't have to do, I told him, as long as I don't have to do a lot, as long as my, your expectations are pretty low, I'll be happy to come help you out. So I went and did this event. Harold Varner won it, and I had a ball. So I had done an event, but when LIV called, they were like, would you be interested in doing one or two of our tournaments? The plan right now is for 2022 is to maybe do a handful of tournaments as test events to see whether or not this thing can get off the ground. And, so I thought about it, and I talked to Sarah about it, and she said, why do you want to do this? She said, we don't need the money. You're having a ball writing, why do you want to do this? And I answered honestly, I said, because after talking to these guys, it's an opportunity to reinvent a little bit of the way golf is done on television. And for me, that was the way it was with Golf Channel. That's the way I felt like it was with ESPN, that it's a chance to take something and take the way it's been done traditionally, and maybe add a few twists and a little spice here and a couple of ingredients there, and really try and be creative and do something that's never been done before. And she looked at me and she said, if that's the reason, then go do it. So I called these guys back and I said, sure, I'll do one or two. And that turned into 8, and that turned into a 2-year contract.
The production, and I wrote about this in a blog entry, is massive. It's so much larger in scale to what you were accustomed to. Number of cameras, just the bells and whistles, as you just alluded to. How much of an adjustment was that? And how much of it did you have to do with? Did you supply them with ideas and innovations and say, let's try this? How did that come to be?
A little bit. I mean, that was, they had a lot of smart people I'm telling you, they had a lot of smart people in rooms trying to figure this thing out, and how to make it stand out, how to be better, how to be different. Geniuses in the world of sports television, like David Hill, Steve Bime, who's the best golf director, one of the best sports directors to ever do it. Sean Bratches, who was at ESPN for a while, Greg Norman, who's an innovator and a really smart guy. They had, they didn't need me. I contributed some once they brought me on board, but the scope of the broadcast, the scope of the production, that was already basically set in stone before I got there. 78 cameras, 30 some, we call them Elvis machines. Basically, they're digital recording devices. The idea of the shotgun start, where everybody's on the golf course at the same time. It's a 5-hour show as opposed to an all day long thing. Everybody's playing under the same conditions, but at the same time, when everybody's on the golf course at the same time, you've got to show, was right into my wheelhouse, show a lot more golf shots and put context to those golf shots. It was, again, smarter people than me. The idea to make it look, to try and make it look more like a video game type look that would attract maybe a younger viewer that wasn't a traditional golf viewer or a golf fan. The pylon came directly from F1, the way that we present our leaderboard. Mm-hmm. That was right from F1. We don't hold shots back. The leaderboard constantly updates. When somebody makes a birdie or a bogey, you see it on the pylon. We'll show that shot to you eventually, but we're not going to not update the pylon like traditional golf broadcasts do to make it seem like we're getting to everything live, because it's impossible. So, we came up with things like Don't Blink, which may or may not have been my idea, which is just kind of a little composition of a couple, 2-3 shots just to keep people caught up on what's going on around the golf course. it's still golf. You're still covering the leaders. You're still covering the stars, but, we're trying to present it in a different way, in a more exciting way, in a more colorful way, in a more informative way than folks, I think, are used to seeing it in traditional golf broadcasts. But again, I can't stress it enough that there were some really, 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 really smart people in the room before I got there.
How do you answer the questions that I know you inevitably get about the source of the funding for LIV? And have you lost friends over this decision?
This is going to sound strange, but I don't have that many friends. I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but yes, of course, there have been comments about the source of the funding. And again, I go back to Sarah because, in her role, it could have, and it almost did blow back on her early on, but we always made it about the production, the opportunity to do something different, the challenge to make golf more exciting and more interesting on television. Those were always the things that I still fall back on, that she stressed. You can go down a rabbit hole about whether Saudi Arabia is good, bad, an ally. And to me, the source of the funding was never what kind of the driving force or anything I really gave a lot of thought to, because of the opportunity. And that may sound like a cop-out, and I'm sorry if it does, but the world is complicated. And, my philosophy is if you get a chance to do something and get a chance to make a difference, then you should maybe try and do that.
I remember coming down to Miami to see the season finale last, I think it was November 22, and told you that came into the truck, 'cause I wanted to see the production, and I told you I was going to write a blog entry about my first trip to a LIV golf event. And your words to me were, be fair.
Yeah.
Do you think that the general media has been fair during all of this?
Yes and no. I mean, everybody's got their likes and their dislikes, and everybody's got to answer to certain masters or to be beholden to certain people. That comment that I made to you was, it's kind of like my, the guiding light. Just be fair. You don't have to like it. You can hate it, but don't dismiss it out of hand. If you're a person that enjoys watching a lot of guys hit a lot of golf shots, then I would challenge you to find any television golf production that shows more golf than we show on our LIV Golf League broadcasts. If if you like to watch stars play golf, LIV Golf League has a bunch of them. If you are open to the concept of a team format in golf, which has never happened, at least on the professional level, give it a shot. It's still in its infancy. I mean, the thing that just floors me almost every day, Whit, is the fact that we've done 15 tournaments. And the fact that this thing is in such an infancy stage is just mind-blowing to me. And, we're constantly trying to get better. We're constantly trying to do something different. We're constantly trying to do something new. We have the LIV Golf League, for better or for worse, has been an incredible disruptor to a sport ecosystem that hadn't seen much disruption over the decades. So, change is hard. Change is hard for people. Disruption is hard for people. But, what we're doing, again, all I would say is give it a chance. Try and have an open mind, watch a couple of shows, watch a tournament. And then if you walk away from it going, it's not for me, more power to you. Not everybody likes the same thing. If everybody liked the same thing, as my mom used to say, this would be a pretty boring world. It's like, maybe there's room for, something different in golf. And, what we're trying to do is just showcase something different.
In just a few seconds, we'll have some closing thoughts on this episode, so stay tuned. If you're enjoying it so far, please consider subscribing or sharing and leave a review. Let me know what you'd like to hear in the future on Media Credentials. Interesting to hear Keith's perspective on LIV Golf and the space it could occupy in the golf ecosystem, especially in light of the news that LIV and the PGA Tour may soon be under the same roof. Emphasis on the word may. On the very day I put together this episode, Monday, June 12th, Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, sent a letter to both the PGA Tour and LIV Golf raising questions about the agreement and requesting extensive documentation. Essentially, the senator is asking for discovery, the very thing that the PGA Tour and LIV Golf were reportedly hoping to avoid by ceasing all pending litigation. I have no doubt, if you're listening to this a week from now or a month from now, the story has changed again. In the meantime, thanks to Keith Hirshland for sharing his story, and thank you for finding this podcast. Thanks again for listening to Media Credentials. For examples of my work, including video and audio clips, a blog, and my contact page, check out whitwatson.com.